Guess what is now being labeled as far-right extremist material? George Orwell, in his book 1984, is now being dubbed as a far-right extremist book. The Lord of the Rings is being called far-right extremism, as is a huge list of other books, including the works of Shakespeare, Kipling, Edmund Burke. This is being called far-right extremism. This is the new definition of it. And I know people. I'll explain this. I know people see this and they're like, "Geez, well, this is what the West has lost its mind to this extent. Maybe Russia's a better option." And I get there are people who see it like that, right? I would argue there can be more than one thing wrong with the world at the same time. Um, I'm not like an absolutist that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to speak. I think that frankly you can just agree that there's corruption in many countries simultaneously, and sometimes corrupt powers fight against each other. There's not necessarily a good guy and a bad guy. Sometimes there can be a bad guy and a bad guy. You know what I mean? I would say this is a symbol of deep corruption. Luckily, I'd say there are good forces in the UK pushing back against this and calling out how ridiculous it is. But let me show you what this says, folks. This is the Daily Mail, and they're laughing about it. They said, you must be having a laugh. Yes, Minister, and the thick of it were, among others, the satire programmers flagged by beleaguering counter-terror prevent scheme for encouraging far-right sympathies. It's this group called Prevent, because they want to prevent extremism. And they're saying that all these books are now encouraging far-right sympathies. How dare you oppose the idea that George Orwell's future is a bad future, right? It says some of Britain's most popular sitcoms and the greatest works of literature were flagged as potential signs of far-right extremism by a counter-terrorism program. And it says further in, the taxpayer-funded document included references to The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, 1984 by George Orwell, and the poems of G.K. Chesterton. It also referenced films including The Bridge on the River Kwai, The Great Escape, and Zulu. Works by some of the world's greatest writers were included as examples of warning signs of potential extremism, including Shakespeare, Chaucer, Milton, Tennyson, Kipling, and Edmund Burke. The report even highlighted the BBC's 1990s political thriller House of Cards, John L. Carr's seminal spy trilogy Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, and Sharp, the ITV drama set in the Napoleonic Wars. And explicitly, it said the BBC's Great British Railway Journeys, presented by former Conservative Minister Michael Portillo, was of interest to the far right. It says historian and broadcaster Andrew Roberts said, quote, "This is truly extraordinary. This is the reading list of anyone who wants a civilized, liberal, cultured education. It includes some of the greatest works in the Western canon, and in some cases, such as Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, powerful critiques of terrorism. Burke, Huxley, Orwell, and Tolkien were all anti-totalitarian writers. A concerning development, because if you're concerned about totalitarianism, apparently that's a gateway to extremism now." It says this, Mr. Murray wrote in the Spectator magazine, a number of books are singled out, the possession or reading of which could point to severe wrongthink, using an Orwell term, and therefore potential radicalization. It seems that RICU is so far off track that it believes that books identifying the problem that it was itself set up to tackle are in fact part of the problem. In other words, George Orwell's 1984 was a warning of what not to do, of what could happen if you allow a surveillance state to take hold, if the government can rewrite history. And they're saying instead, how dare you criticize our surveillance state? How dare you criticize our rewriting of history? And you must be an extremist for reading this book that would warn you against the righteous things we plan to do to you. That's the way they're framing it. It says he concluded that Riku's work, RICU's, was pathetic and called for accountability for its errors and sacking by the score. The list has emerged following a major review of the Prevent scheme by William Shawcross. His report published earlier this month exposed serious failings in Prevent, that's the organization pushing this, warning, taxpayer funded in the UK, warning that it applies to a double standard to Islamist and far-right threats. The £49 million per year scheme had prioritized countering far-right activity above tackling the prime Islamist threat, it added. The report said Prevent had scrutinized right-wing materials which fell well short of the extremist threshold altogether. Home Secretary Suella Braverman told the MPs Prevent had defined the extreme right-wing too broadly, encompassing the respectable right and the center right. And a Home Office spokesperson said, the Home Secretary made clear that Prevent will now ensure it focuses on the key threat of Islamist terrorism, as well as remaining vigilant of emerging threats. And it says, we've accepted all 34 recommendations and are committed to protecting our country from the threat posed by terrorism. Do you get what happened? In my opinion, this is like trying to using legislation to try to dig yourself out of bad legislation is like digging a hole to try to dig yourself out of a hole. Rather than fix the very problem that was created, they're expanding the problem in order to broaden it and normalize it. They're not talking about the idea that they've listed, all these famous Western authors as being gateways to extremism. They're saying, why did you only include them, but you're not going after the Islamist extremists? You're not going after the, Islamist terrorism. What you're going to get is not the pulling back on this, in other words. You're not going to get them rolling this back. You're not going to get them saying, okay, George Orwell was not an extremist writer. J.R. Tolkien was not an extremist writer. What you're going to get instead is that George Orwell was an extremist writer, but, we should also go against terrorism on all sides. They're not fixing the problem, in other words. They're expanding it. They're expanding it so the encompassing of things that shouldn't even be there in the first place are normalized within the broad spectrum of including legitimate terrorism. That's all they're doing. The rewriting of Roald Dahl. If you've watched Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or Matilda, that's Roald Dahl. And it says, across his beloved children's books, hundreds of authors' words have been changed or entirely removed in bid for relevancy. And this is private business doing it, by the way. Now, if you read George Orwell and you write about how they're rewriting history and removing words and they have newspeak, this is what Orwell warned about. This is exactly what George Orwell warned about. But let me show you what this article says. It says, words matter begins the discreet notice, which sits at the bottom of the copyright page of Puffin's latest editions of Roald Dahl's books. The wonderful the words of Roald Dahl can transport you to different worlds and introduce you to the most marvelous characters. This book was written many years ago, and so we regularly review the language to ensure that it can continue to be enjoyed by all today. Put simply, these words may not be the words that Dahl wrote. The publishers have given themselves license to edit the writer as they see fit, chopping, altering, and adding where necessary to bring his books in line with contemporary sensibilities. This is an article that's positive towards this, by the way. By comparing these latest editions with earlier versions of the text, The Telegraph has found hundreds of changes to Dahl's stories. Language related to weight, mental health, violence, gender, and race has been cut and rewritten. Remember the Cloud Men in James and the Giant Peach? They are now the Cloud People. The small fox in Fantastic Mr. Fox are now female. In Matilda, a mention in Rudyard Kipling has been cut and Jane Austen added. in Roald Dahl, but different, right? It's Roald Dahl, but different. And they say, this is not the first time his works have been controversial. The Oompa Loompas, those little orange men, the diminutive employees of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory have been extensively reimagined over the years. In recent years, Dahl has been criticized. He's dead, but it says in recent years, Roald Dahl has been criticized for anti-Semitism, misogyny, and racism. And it says the modern editor faces a dilemma: how to retain Dahl's compelling spikiness, which has enthralled generations of readers, while bringing it in line with the hair-trigger sensibilities of children's publishing. And it goes on and on and on over all the language they've altered in these books.